Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Robert Conrad, Cleveland State University, the Chautauqua Institution, the Cleveland Clinic, and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.
Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Paul Harris, immediate past president of the City Club's Board of Directors. Happy to be back here. And it's my pleasure to welcome Richard Cordray to the City Club. He's here as part of our ongoing effort to put you in conversation with the people shaping the future of Ohio and the people who hope to lead it, specifically now the candidates for governor of the state of Ohio. In 2018, Ohioans will head to the polls to cast votes in races in all 16 congressional seats, 1 Senate seat, and the offices of Governor, Lieutenant Governor, Attorney General, Secretary of State, Treasurer, and Auditor. In the past 18 months, we have heard from 4 Republican Party candidates and 3 Democratic Party candidates for governor. In addition to Mr. Cordray today, we will hear from Democratic Party candidates Betty Sutton, the former administrator of the St. Lawrence Seaway Development Corporation, and Ohio Supreme Court Justice William O'Neill next month. Now back to Mr. Cordray. A native of Grove City, he was first elected to office in 1990 as a member of the Ohio House of Representatives. He went on to serve as Ohio's first Solicitor General, during which service he argued 6 cases before the United States Supreme Court. After running for Attorney General in an Ohio Senate seat, Mr. Cordray was elected Franklin County Treasurer before going on to serve as Treasurer of Ohio in 2006. 2 years later, he was elected Ohio Attorney General. On July 11, 2011, Mr. Cordray became the Director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, or the CFPB, via a recess appointment by President Obama. The CFPB was created in 2010 as part of the Dodd-Frank Act. He was confirmed by the U.S. Senate in 2013 and held the position until November 24, 2017. You may have read a little bit about that, and we may hear about that during his remarks. He received his JD from the University of Chicago, his master's degree from Oxford University's Brazen Rose College, and his bachelor's degree from Michigan State University. Mr. Cordray announced his gubernatorial bid on December 5th. So ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please welcome gubernatorial candidate Richard Cordray.
Thank you, Paul, and first of all, thank you to all of you who came. I heard there was going to be quite a snowstorm up here last night, and somehow you braved it. Maybe it wasn't quite as bad as was advertised. Sometimes they happen, sometimes not, as you know. And I'm glad to be here with you today, and I thank you all for coming. And for those of you who are watching, streaming online, thank you for taking the time to be with us today. Dan Moulthrop has been after me for quite some time to come and speak at the City Club about the work I had been doing at the U.S. Consumer Financial Protection Bureau over the last several years. And I had put you off, Dan, and put you off, and I'm glad to finally accept. And I now find that I have probably 2 or 3 different speeches to give. So I'll do my best to fit that into the time available, which is a good amount of time, but also to leave time for questions, because one of the things I know about the City Club, and I've been here twice before, although as Dan noted, both of those times were for debates. It is a place where we can engage in civic and civil discourse with one another. We can air disagreements with one another appropriately and reasonably, and we can think together about how we solve problems together in the state of Ohio and in the United States of America. And that is a quality and an occasion that is unfortunately in short supply these days, much shorter supply than I think people deserve here and around the country. And I saw some of that up close and personal in Washington, D.C. over the last 7 years. And I am glad to be back in Ohio and running for governor of this great state. So let me talk about how I'm going to organize this. I'm going to talk about three things. I'll break this into three parts. I will talk for a bit, as you had requested, Dan, about my time at the U.S. Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. I will then talk in particular about this last year. You may have noticed it was an interesting year, and particularly interesting from where I sat. And I'll talk a little bit about my next venture. As I said the other day in speaking to an audience, I am now gainfully unemployed. I am on a job search. I told my wife it's likely to be a long job search, but I hope to be your next governor of this state. And I'll talk a little bit about why I'm running and what I intend. But I'll start a little bit with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and catching many of you up on what I've been doing since I was here last. So in December of 2010, I had been defeated in my race for Attorney General that year. I was contacted by a woman I had never met and did not know, named Elizabeth Warren, who wanted to recruit me to come to the Consumer Bureau, and she wanted me in particular to set up and run the enforcement division of that bureau, which is the area that, very similar to work I had done as Attorney General, would enforce the laws against the biggest banks and the largest and most powerful financial companies in the nation. And I was skeptical because I didn't see us moving our family. My wife and I have twins who were in 6th grade at the time to Washington, D.C. You may have noticed Elizabeth can be very persuasive, and she started talking to me about doing a long-distance commute, and she said, oh, Bruce and I have done that over the years. We've been at different law schools at different times, and it's manageable, and next thing you know, I decided I would give it a try for a year or two. And then she tricked me. So 6 months in, she recommended me to President Obama to be the first director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And that was an honor and an opportunity and a challenge that I could not turn down. So I was assigned to head over to the White House and have an interview with President Obama. You might imagine that was a pretty momentous occasion for me. I was put at ease because as I came into the area near the Oval Office, I saw Reggie, his constant companion on the campaign trail, sitting there, and Reggie was working with him for the first year or two in the White House. And I knew Reggie and said hello. And then next thing I knew, the president came bouncing out of the Oval Office and he said, yeah, Reggie and I were just talking. We usually see you at some VFW hall somewhere in Ohio. And I thought, well, maybe this is going to go pretty well. And he talked to me for about 20 minutes about how strongly he felt about this new agency and the work that we had to do. He talked about work he had done going all the way back to the Illinois Senate, and it reminded me of work that I had done both as treasurer at the state and county levels and also as Attorney General here, just to have someone to stand on the side of regular consumers. You know, who are consumers? It's everybody in this room. It's everybody in our society. Everybody is a consumer. To stand on your side and see that you're treated fairly in the financial marketplace against some of the most powerful players in our society. And that sounded to me like something that I was, many of my experiences in life had somehow led to this opportunity, not by plan or direction because the job didn't exist a year before that. But I thought this is something that I could and should do, and it would be an honor. So I was nominated. I had a sense it was going to be a difficult confirmation fight because there were already 43 Republican senators who had laid down a marker that they would confirm no one as the new head of the Consumer Bureau until the Bureau was reformed, and they were dissatisfied with the legislative provision for it. I told the president that I hoped I would not regret it, but I would be willing to do this, and he assured me that I would not regret it. We then set out on a confirmation fight that took 2 years. I was filibustered twice in the U.S. Senate, blocked. We always had a majority of votes for confirmation, but under the Senate rules, that was not enough. In January of 2012, some of you will remember, I've been reminded of it by people as I've been moving around Ohio over the last week. We came to Shaker Heights High School, and I'll tell you the background. So we thought that the president might want to make a recess appointment because things were just stymied in the Senate, and the will of the Senate was being blocked by the filibuster. And We thought that that would happen the day of the in-between of the two sessions of Congress. No word came that day, and we were fairly depressed. And then the next day, I got a call from Bill Daley, the chief of staff to the president, who said, "Where are you going to be tomorrow?" And I said, "Where do you want me to be?" And he said, "Well, if you can, we're going to be going to Cleveland." And I said, "Sure. You let me know how are we going to get there." And he said, "We'll be on Air Force One." So the next day, I reported to the White House, and we went on the helicopter to Air Force One. There were 4 of us on the plane, as I recall. There was President Obama. There was Valerie Jarrett, who's become a strong friend and supporter of mine. There was Jay Carney, who was the press secretary at the time. And then there was me. They were the 4 of us. And at one point on the flight, President was doing his work up in the front. He kind of comes sauntering back, and he encouraged me to call people, talk to people on the phone. He says, "Not every day people get a call from Air Force One." So I said, "All right, I'll call my dad." So I called my dad. And I said, "This is Rich." And he says, "All right, probably in the middle of doing something." And I said, "I'm calling you from Air Force One." And he said, "What's that?" And so the next thing I know, the president took the phone, and the president says, "Well, Mr. Cordray, I bet you're very proud of your son." And my dad said what he always says, which is, "I'm proud of all my sons." So anyway, that was a very special day. We came to Shaker Heights High School. He announced that he was appointing me the director of the Consumer Bureau, and off we went. And our job then for me, it turned out to be 5.5 years. Trying to remember, 5.5 out of 6.5 total, yes. I was the director of a new agency that when I had first arrived there had 50 employees, and we were in sort of makeshift space. Kind of reminds me of this new campaign for governor, actually. And we built that into, I think, a powerhouse for good in our society. And what did we do during the time I was there? We took enforcement actions near to my heart. That was what I set up there at the agency against the major financial companies in the nation for issues where we felt that they had cheated or mistreated people. Needed to be set right, and we put $12 billion back in people's pockets where it should not have been taken from them in the first place. And we cleaned up a lot of practices, some of them deliberate, some of them just negligent or not carefully overseen. But if you're somebody on the other end of it and you're hurt by some fee or problem or issue, it doesn't really matter to you, does it? It's something that needs to be fixed and changed, and that's what we did. We also created an interesting tool, an amazing tool, really, and it was not me, but it was the people at the Bureau who figured out how to do it. In the statute, we were required to take consumer complaints from people all over the country. And that was a scary thing because we had no idea what the volume would be of those complaints. But we organized it and we put it together and we started taking credit card complaints at first, which are a little easier because they're often $10, $15, $30, and you can deal with them in somewhat discrete chunks. Then we started taking, and Jim Rackakis in this room will know this well, mortgage complaints, and those are much more complicated and much more money is at stake. And they are difficult problems to solve. And eventually we took complaints across the whole spectrum. Over the years I was there, 1.3 million Americans filed complaints with us, and they got problems fixed. So if they had a problem on their credit report, maybe there was a mistake or an error, and nobody would listen to them, nobody would bother to fix it for them, and that would block them from getting a mortgage or a car loan, things that start to loom large in people's lives. We fixed those problems, and I was proud of it. And we would hear back from people who were surprised. They were surprised to learn that somebody actually would fix a problem for them, or that 3 days later that thing was fixed that they had been talking about for months. And it was just a real pleasure to have the chance to do that. Or if somebody was being harassed by debt collectors, I don't know if it's ever been true of any of you, they'll call all hours of the day, they'll call all hours of the night, they'll call in the workplace, they do a lot of things, some of which are legal and some of which are not. But unless somebody stops them, they do it. And we got those calls stopped. Or, and there was a case I remember in particular, there was a young man in the military. Like many military service members, he had just left home for the first time, never been out on his own. Now he's at a base. He's got a guaranteed government paycheck for the first time, and he is a ripe target for scammers and predators. And Somebody had put him in a terrible auto loan, and his dad was mad about it, and his dad was complaining everywhere he could think of, and nobody was doing anything. And he brought the complaint to us at the Consumer Bureau, and over time, we brought an enforcement action and got back thousands of dollars for 1,600 active duty service members, and that was good work that we did. So that was what I did for the next 5.5 years. And there was opposition, and there was criticism, and there was pushback all the way. Because people don't like to have someone looking over their shoulder, or people didn't want to have to change, or they didn't want to be called out in enforcement action, or they didn't want to have to give money back to people. And I always regarded that as a badge of honor. The more criticism we got, I felt that if they were criticizing us for trying to do too much to help consumers, again, all of us, that was the price I had to pay to do that good work, and I was willing to pay it. Now let me fast forward to this year. So there was an election in November of 2016. You may remember it. And as soon as that election was decided, there started to be intensive calls and voluminous calls for me to be fired from that job because of the so-called overreach and unaccountability of the Bureau and various criticisms. That created a very difficult climate. We had a lawsuit at the time pending in the Court of Appeals in D.C. as to whether I could only be fired for cause or could be fired at will, and that lawsuit was a complicating factor in things, a helpfully complicating factor in things. But there were people putting together the dossiers of why I should be fired for cause, and that would have been a smear attack on me personally and on the Bureau personally, and I took it personally. And we prepared a lawsuit that I would have brought personally to sue the president if he had fired me from that job. I was going to stand and fight, and I let the administration know that, and I think that that fight perhaps was not worth their while. So the next question was, and my children actually found an analogy in, I guess it's Greek mythology, the sword of Damocles. Do you remember, everybody remember the sword of Damocles? Hanging over the person's head by a string, ready to fall at any time. That was sort of what I was under. And starting on January 20th, I went to work each day, not knowing in the morning whether I would be fired by the evening. And then the question was, while I was under that sword, were we going to do things? Were we going to continue to fight for consumers and work for consumers? Or were we going to duck our heads and pull in our horns and not do anything to rock the boat? I was not willing to stay there if I was going to not rock the boat. We had important work to do. It was continuing the work that we had been doing, and there were two rules in particular that we had spent years of work on that I thought it was important to get done. The first was a rule about arbitration clauses, which blocked people from going to court, and people banding together to go to court to get wrongs righted. And I thought it was important for us to finish that rule, which we did. You may have seen that the Congress then acted and ended up overturning the rule on a 50-50 vote in the Senate, where they motorcaded Mike Pence across town to cast the deciding vote to overturn that rule, and the president signed that into law. We did all we could on that one. But I will tell you that 3 days later, Barney Frank, who was the author of the Dodd-Frank Act, called me and said, "Rich, I know you're disappointed, and your people are disappointed, but understand you've made this into a visible issue, and someday the arc of history will change, and that will be legislated, and that will be changed. So don't despair. You fought a very good fight, and it was an important fight." Although it was also a sign of how much more could I get done. There was one more thing that was very important to me and to the Bureau. We'd put years of work into a rule on payday lending. Those of you in this state perhaps remember that payday lending was reined in by the voters of this state in 2008 by an overwhelming margin, but lenders continue to operate, and we have some of the highest interest rates in the nation here at 581%. Check that, 581% on these loans. And they trap people in debt, and they create a lot of misery across the country. And we had had faith leaders come to us for years and talk about people in their congregations, people in their parishes, people in their temples, in their churches, who talked to them about the misery this was spreading in their lives. So I was bound and determined to finish that rule, and knew that I would probably kick myself for the rest of my life if we hadn't gotten that done. We finished that rule in October. It didn't get published the wonderful ways of bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. and the Federal Register until November, and that was the signal for me that it was time that if I wanted to leave, I could leave. I could have stayed a few more months, served a few more months of my term. I only had a few left. If I had done that, I would have missed what I thought was a very important challenge back here in Ohio, which was to run for governor of this state in 2018. And so I had been all year pushing to get certain work done that I thought was important, that we devoted a lot of time and effort to, but at the same time hoping that I wouldn't be too late for the governor's race. And it was an excruciating year in that regard. And I believe I'm not too late. And if those of you in this room and those of you watching will help make sure that I'm not too late, I hope you will understand that that's why I'm running for governor now, rather than back in May when it might have been politically more sensible. But again, I was serving my country. It was important work, and I needed to get it done. So I hope you can understand that. So let me talk a little bit. That tells me that you understand that. Thank you. So let me talk a little bit about why I'm running for governor of Ohio. And we kicked off this campaign at a diner in my hometown by the felicitous name of Lily's Kitchen Table. And it's a wonderful place, and I go there quite a bit on the weekends. I've always commuted back and forth to Washington, D.C. People are welcoming me back to Ohio. I've always been in Ohio, and my children went from the 6th grade through middle school, through high school, and graduated from high school just last spring. And I calculated that I had made that flight back and forth to Washington, D.C. over 300 times over those 6.5 years. And I was willing to make that sacrifice, and my family was willing to have me make that sacrifice because they didn't want to move to Washington, D.C. And by the time I finally got confirmed, they're like, well, we're in this pattern. You keep going back and forth. We're very happy here. And my children used to call me every day about 6:20 in the morning and talk to me during breakfast, and I was not always at my best during those conversations, but it made things okay. So I kicked off my campaign for governor by saying that there are two things that I bring to this race, and I think maybe there's three. The first is that I have had a very consistent vision and focus for the last 15 years in local, state, and federal office, which is on what we call the kitchen table issues that affect people the most in their lives, how they handle the economic issues of their lives, how they stay up at night worrying about paying the bills, how they're worried about keeping their job or getting a somewhat better job, how they're worried about affording health care, how they're worried about preparing for retirement and helping young people in the family and those not so young have the skills and training they need to remain viable in the workforce. Those are the things that will be my focus as a candidate for governor because they've been my focus steadily for many years. And I've been all over this country working on financial issues with people, and I will tell you that there are different issues in Arizona and in Florida and in Maine than in Ohio, but there are many, many issues in common. And those are things that I have learned, and those are things that I will bring to this effort. And those are things I will bring to the governor's office as well. The second thing that I can offer is a track record of getting results on these issues. I am willing to stand and fight for principles that are important. I'm willing to stand up and fight for people so that they have the opportunity, again, to be treated fairly in their lives and with dignity and respect. And it's not always about the money for people. It's about being respected and treated in an appropriate manner. And we saw that again and again. I remember a field hearing we had in Detroit. There was an elderly woman who stood up during the public testimony portion. She wasn't very tall, so she stood up, and she wasn't very easily distinguished in the crowd, but she piped up, and she had something she wanted to say. And what she had to say was that the credit reporting companies, and that was the subject of the discussion that day, the credit reporting companies think that I'm dead, and I can't convince them otherwise. And what was interesting was she was obviously very much alive, very energetic woman, and they just wouldn't give her the time of day to bother to fix her file or to take her documentation or make it right for her. And it wasn't just the fact of the matter, but obviously she felt that if she had been somebody, they would have fixed it for her. But because she was nobody in their eyes, they wouldn't bother to do that. And she wanted just the dignity and respect to be treated like everyone else. And that was an interesting lesson for me, because that was a big portion of much of the work that we did there, was not just the $20 or the $50, but somebody being required to take the time to bother to deal with it and to make it right. I have a track record of getting results, and I'll go back to when I was in local office here and worked with local officials around the state. And at that time, one of the big crises affecting the state was the foreclosure crisis, and you will remember it. And we're not entirely through it even to this day. And that was people losing their homes because of the financial problems that were happening, irresponsible lending, predatory lending in a lot of our communities. And up in Cleveland, we saw it enormously through communities in the city and communities in the surrounding areas, and also throughout the state. And there was a time when Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana led the parade in terms of foreclosures across the nation. Not a statistic you want to be leading in. And then eventually other states caught up with us, but it wasn't because we were doing better, it was because they also were doing worse. And then we had the financial crisis. We put together task forces across the state. We called them Save Our Homes Task Forces. It was just a homemade thing. This was not in anybody's job description. Nobody understood it. Nobody knew what to do with it. It was an unprecedented problem that we hadn't seen since the Great Depression. And we put together state officials and local officials, and this work continued while I was Treasurer and Attorney General. We put together our great nonprofits in our communities that do so much to raise the quality of life for people. And we put together people from the private sector who recognized a problem and a need to deal with it and were willing to step up. And that's how we put people together to fix that problem and to address it as best we could. And I call that now, that's the Ohio way, is to bring people together to solve problems, to bring all of our talent together and have people work in tandem with one another. And it is very different from what we're seeing out of Washington, D.C., where we see so much conflict being fomented, so much division being created, so much scapegoating and pitting people against each other. And I will tell you, I have never seen that help to solve a single problem in our society, and I don't think it's helping to solve them now. And so that's been my way of doing things, and that's what I will bring to this governor's race. As treasurer of the state, we had a small business assistance program where we could do low-interest loans to small business to help them grow jobs. 2 out of every 3 jobs in our economy is grown by small businesses. And we worked on that. And that's something I want to bring to the governor's office, because supporting small business is hard. It means doing a lot of work with a lot of small companies, but it is what raises the quality of life in our communities, and that's something I will focus on. And as Attorney General, I got results because we needed to clean up after the financial crisis. We needed to take on Wall Street. I was willing to do that. We recovered $2 billion for our taxpayers and retirees who had been defrauded on various schemes over that period of time. So that's the record that I will bring to this race. Again, it's a focus on the things I think matter most in people's lives, and it's a record of being able to solve problems and get results by bringing people together to do that. And the third thing I will say is I can win this race, and none of the rest of it matters unless you can win, and I can do that. Mike DeWine and I, if that's the rematch, and it could be for next year, we ran to within a dead heat, 1 point of each other in 2010. And that turned out, in retrospect, to be a tough year, the Tea Party year for Democrats across the country. And I think we saw the other night in Alabama that 2018 is going to be a very different year. And I think that I'm the person who can win this office and then bring that track record and that vision to the governor's mansion. And I hope to have the chance to do that. But it will only happen if many of you will join us and help us. And if you do, then we can accomplish great things. And I hope and expect and would request that you consider doing that. And I thank you for the chance to be here today. Thank you.
So today we are enjoying a forum in our Ohio 2018 Meet the Candidate series, a conversation with Richard Cordray, former director of the CFPB and Democratic candidate for governor of Ohio. We're about to begin our audience Q&A portion. We welcome questions from everyone, City Club members, guests, students, or those of you joining us via our webcast or Facebook Live video. If you'd like to tweet a question, please tweet it at the City Club, and our staff will endeavor to work it into the program. Holding the microphones today are Content Coordinator Bliss Davis, and there's Bliss, and Youth Forum Council Chair Tiolu Orsonia. First question, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Merle Johnson. I'm a member of the Ohio Board of Education, and I asked this question of the other of 4 gubernatorial candidates at the City Club debate. The Ohio Supreme Court ruled Ohio's system for funding schools unconstitutional 4 times because of an over-reliance on property taxes. Presently, 55.62% of school revenue comes from property tax, the same as the year of the first Ohio Supreme Court decision 20 years ago. This means education quality is still being determined by zip code. As governor, would you address this inequity? If so, how?
So I would agree with what I understand to be the tenor of your question, which is that we have not solved that problem over the last 20 years. There was an effort made, there was an original decision by the Ohio Supreme Court that, if enforced, would have meant reallocation of funding across the state to solve exactly the problem you describe, which is that we have young people who are born and grow up in what is supposed to be a classless society, but depending on where they're born and what community and what schools they attend, their horizons are either limited or expanded through no fault of their own, no choice of their own. Our two children, our twins that I mentioned, went through the public schools near Grove City, Ohio. The same school district my brothers and I went through many years ago. We got a solid education there that prepared us for the future, and it's still happening in many schools across the state because of the dedicated and inspiring efforts of many teachers, individual teachers who make such a difference to many young people. But it's still the case that if you don't have the right funding of the school districts, and if you don't have equitable funding of the school districts, those opportunities are going to be greater in some places and lesser in others. And the other piece that I would say about this is, and this is something that I think needs to change, we have now had for years in Ohio, we have been the subject of a great experiment. This is the charter school experiment. And some charter schools have done well. Many have done quite poorly, and there has been no monitoring and oversight of those efforts. And the ECOT problem that we have seen blow up this past couple years is a scandal. You have young people who are out of the public schools. They're supposedly attending school online. They're not even bothering to take attendance or monitoring whether they're actually doing anything, but the money is following them out for the public schools. So one of the first things I think we need to do is rein in this guinea pigging of Ohio children through the charter school experiment and make sure that the money is back where it should be in strengthening our public schools. If certain charter schools are operating well, they can perhaps be allowed to continue, but the many that are not operating well, that money needs to go back to the public schools. In terms of where we go with other school funding issues, I will take more bearings on that and soundings as I go around the state, but that's what I would have to say today about that.
Rich, welcome to the campaign.
Thank you.
Back when I graduated from high school in the 1970s, maybe half of our class did not go to college.
Careful, you don't want to put a date on
I know,
that.
but they thought they could get good jobs in factories or mills or on the railroad and get a middle-class lifestyle. Today, with automation, those jobs just aren't there. So my fear is that there's going to be a generation coming up that will graduate from high school, not go to college, and not find a job that can get them into the middle class. What can Ohio do to transform its economy to address the needs of those young people?
This is a challenge that is going to be front and center for the next governor of this state. It's a challenge that the current governor has identified, but progress is partial on it thus far. I was at a center in Marion County the other day called Ramtech, where they are providing advanced training in robotics and handling some of the tools that allow people to be hired into high-paying jobs, $25, $30 an hour at places like Honda and other places in Central Ohio. But you're right, Ed, that part of the problem is there aren't enough of those jobs to go around right now, because in manufacturing, we're producing about the same amount as we always have. It's not true we're not making things in America anymore, but we're doing it with many, many fewer workers, and it's become capital intensive and not labor intensive. So as the economy continues to change and adapt, one of the things we have to do is make sure workforce development and worker training and apprenticeship programs and other things are keeping pace with the changes in our society. And we have lagged that, and we have what people refer to as the skills gap right now. We have many, many jobs in our society going unfulfilled or unfilled because we can't match them with the individual skills of people coming into the workforce. They just don't match the opportunities. That's a failure on our part. Now, it's not easy to keep pace with a rapidly changing economy, and you know, the service sector has been increased dramatically in our generation, and the manufacturing sector has shrunk in terms of employment. But we have to make sure that we do a better job with our school districts, with our vocational programs, with our apprenticeship programs, with our community colleges, and keep those things current to one another. Again, the fact that there are many people who want to work but don't have the skills to fill these jobs, and there are many employers who would like to have people working for them, and they're held back by not being able to fill critical positions, you know, is a mismatch that we have to address. It's not going to be easy. I don't have a magic formula to give you that's going to solve that problem, but it's got to be a top priority for the government of this state. The other thing I would say that hurts people in terms of not being able to fill these jobs is there are many people in many parts of the state who are failing drug tests. And the opioid crisis, and not just the opioid crisis, but drug problems across the state are significant and severe. And to me, it reminds me in its own way of the foreclosure crisis that we faced 10 years ago, where it's a problem that is unprecedented. It is not within anybody's particular job description. The only way to solve it is by bringing people together. Again, I would call it the Ohio way, and bringing together state and local government and private sector and nonprofits to work this problem through. And it's a complicated problem, but that's the only way we can solve a problem like that. And I'll say another thing that I know you can relate to and understand from your own life in politics and government. I believe that this state legislature, and I don't think it's too strong a term, has been waging war on local governments in this state for years now. They have taken money from local governments. They've typically wanted to hand it back to the taxpayers in the form of tax cuts that often help those who need it the least. At the same time, local governments, for those who know, are the ones who do face-to-face services with people and do so much to improve the quality of life in our communities, often working with the nonprofit agencies that they fund and support and work in tandem with them. We can't solve problems in this state if we're pitting state government against local government. That does not work. And I've talked to local officials throughout the state over the past, it's been 9 days now, feels like 90. Been in about 15 cities so far, and more to come over the rest of this week. They get it, they understand that. And by the way, just an example of this, yesterday, the state auditor put out a report on signs of fiscal distress in 9 cities, including Akron, Canton, Lorain. And my question is, whose fault is that? You know, why are our cities showing fiscal distress? It's in large part because the state legislature has not valued our cities or our counties, has not provided them with the resources, has taken resources from them. And then when we have unexpected problems to deal with, like the opioid crisis, how on earth are they going to do that on top of trying to, you know, tighten their belt when the state government doesn't tighten its belt to address things? It's just not the right way forward, and I will change that when I'm governor.
How do you do, sir? I've asked this question also of several of the other candidates. If you want to talk about innovation, immigrants have the potential to bring this to Ohio. They are some of the most hardworking, most innovative people that I know. At the same time, we lag behind other areas of the country in terms of attracting them. What would you do as governor to attract more immigrants to settle here?
So I think the first thing is to have an open and welcoming and inviting atmosphere. And that's not something that we're doing well on in this country right now, emanating from the very top of the country. The America that I know has been an America that has welcomed the people who are willing to pull up roots from all over the world, take a lot of risk, venture to have a better life for themselves and their families, and come to this country because they see this as a beacon of freedom and hope and opportunity. All of us in this room can think back to ancestors, you know, 1 generation, 2 generations, 3 generations ago, in some cases voluntary, in some cases involuntarily, who came from somewhere else and have forged a life here in America. I attend and preside over a number of naturalization ceremonies. The federal judges in Central Ohio know that I love to do those, and I've done it many a time. And to see the people from all over the world who want to come here, want to be part of the United States of America, it is a tremendous compliment to us in this society. It is a tremendous advantage for us because these are the go-getters, the people who are actually have the drive and initiative to take the risk to make something better, and they're hard workers, and we should welcome that. And I believe mayors around the state understand that and are trying to welcome that. It's difficult when immigration policy being driven at the federal level is so different, but that's my attitude, and I think it's the attitude of many Americans. And if we think back about our own family histories, it's exactly what led people to this country in the first place.
We have a question from Twitter. Given the current climate around women's issues, particularly sexual assault...
What's Twitter's first name?
I don't know, I'm sorry.
Just kidding.
And particularly sexual assault and harassment of women by powerful men, and the fact that many men, including President Obama, have proposed that having more women in leadership positions could be a solution. Why did you choose to make such a late entrance into an already crowded Democratic gubernatorial primary race that is dominated by qualified women? And would you consider joining a female-led ticket as lieutenant governor candidate?
That Twitter has a mind of its own, doesn't it? So in my talk, I believe I tried to address why I'm late to this race, and it has to do with work that I felt I had to do serving my country in Washington, D.C. And for those who feel that's not an adequate explanation, that's the reason, and that's why I'm in late. As to why I'm running for governor, it's because I think I personally offer a vision and a focus that has been honed over years, that I offer a track record of getting results on those issues. I do not have and will never have things bad to say about the other candidates who have gotten into this race and preceded me and worked for months in this race, and I know what that is like because I've done it myself, and I know what it's like to run first time statewide, and it's a very difficult thing in Ohio. And it's very hard to do that, to introduce yourself to people all over the state and expect to be able to win tough races in the fall. And I've been there, I've done that, I've learned from that. I believe that I'm in a position to win in this race, and if we don't win, nothing else matters, it's all just talk. As to the female candidates in this race and as to the female issues that people are very fervently and I think powerfully bringing to the fore, that is a good thing. It's a great thing. Just as the work at the Bureau, I have hated to see powerful interests oppress people that they view as having less power than themselves and taking advantage of people and getting away with it. The same is true of sexual harassment. To be able to overpower people or to overawe them and to do things that are uncomfortable or unwelcome or worse has no place in our society, and it's had a place far too long because people have been coerced or intimidated into not speaking up. People are throwing that off now, and they are speaking up, and it is going to change America, and it has been a great year for that. And I expect and hope and will do my part to ensure more of that. When I was Attorney General, we worked with victims of domestic violence who had their own issues in that regard. And it was always a difficult and tragic thing to figure out how you sort out people's lives when they've been subjected to unwelcome physical and or mental abuse, often over long periods of time, and have not felt that there's anything that they could do about it. That is wrong, and we will all address it together. So that's what I'd have to say. Yeah.
Congress is in the process of pushing through a sweeping tax bill. And so this question might be a little premature because the tax bill is changing minute by minute, and we don't really know ultimately what it's going to say. But it's anticipated that it will explode the deficit. What do you see will get then forced down to the states and that the next governor will have to navigate?
Yeah. So I haven't been able to keep up with all the news up to the minute as I've been going around the state, but I saw last night that the House and Senate seem to be getting closer and closer together toward a final deal on this. It is a terrible deal for the United States of America, if you ask me. It is going to cost us $1.5 trillion, and it's not going to build anything in our society. I remember there were promises about infrastructure. We were going to have these beautiful roads and bridges, and that would have built something lasting and meaningful in our society. It would have created jobs for people and people who need those jobs. This is going to waste all of that money, and then I don't think we're going to get the infrastructure that we need. At the same time, it's the same old, same old. It is offering lots of money to people who need it least. If you go back and look 50 years ago, individuals paid about 7% of the total, and corporations paid 5%. Fast forward 50 years, individuals still 7%, corporations down to 2%. And yet we are making a priority to give more tax cuts to corporations. There's slabs for them, there's crumbs for people like the middle-class people in our society. I think it is wrong. It is in the tenor of the policy that's been pursued at the State House in Columbus by the state legislature. It's tax cuts that, again, are typically skewed toward the wealthy, those who need it the least, and it does very little to create and promote economic growth, although that's always how it's been sold. And by the way, that's how this bill is being sold yet again. And if you look at Ohio, Tom Suttis captured it last weekend. We've gone from 96% of the per capita mean income of the United States of America in the 80s to 91% today. That was all policy of tax cuts driven by this legislature, and what did it get us? I don't think it got us much. So I object to it. I think it's wrong. It will make things harder for the next governor of the state, and this next governor will have to push back on the legislature in terms of fairness for people across the board.
I have a similar question about tax reform. With all my kids living out of state because they can't find jobs in Ohio, with this new tax reform bill, it seems that there may be an exodus of Ohioans, and also harder for companies to relocate in Ohio. I wonder if you have any thoughts for Ohio.
Well, look, it's a huge concern. This was true 10 years ago. It's as true or truer today. I remember speaking in Parma a number of years ago and referring to the lyrics of the Irish song Danny Boy, where the mother is seeing her son go off for years. Perhaps we'll never see him again because of the exodus from Ireland at that time. And I said, that's what Ohio is getting to be. And it's not a great thing. It is a very hard thing for our communities to see some of our young people, our best and brightest, go off elsewhere for opportunities that they can't get in the state. And there's no reason why they can't get those opportunities in the state, but we need to, state government can do its part, private sector needs to do its part, nonprofit agencies do their part, and that's how we solve these things together. I don't, again, have a magic bullet to offer you today, but I don't have a good sense of how economic development's working at the state level because Jobs Ohio is not very transparent. Once we get a chance to see what's being done there may be big changes that are needed. But I will tell you one thing. From what I saw when I was state treasurer, small businesses are a great place to devote tremendous amount of time and effort and attention because they typically are less likely to move and they have opportunities to grow. And people like working in small businesses. It is a lifestyle enhancer, and a lot of surveys show that. And so again, for me as governor, a lot of my attention would be paid to figuring out how we can boost and expand the growth of our small businesses in Ohio. And I think that that's a sound policy, but it will be hard work.
Would you share with us one or two of your experiences while in Washington that's unique to that experience that would be useful and helpful to you when you're governor?
How much time do you have? Well, look, we were under fire at the Consumer Bureau all along. Unfortunately, when the financial reform bill went through the Congress, and it was badly needed, we had a crisis that was epic in our lifetimes. We will never see anything like that again, I can confidently predict. And we hadn't seen anything like it since the Great Depression, and in some ways it was worse. In some ways it was maybe not so worse, but similar. So there had to be reform. And yet the reform bill became partisan as it went through the Congress, and that was a bad thing. Big reform bills need to have a bipartisan foundation if they're going to last and if they're going to be secure. And Congressman Eckert in this room would know that from his experience in the Congress, and it didn't have that. So we had opposition from the beginning and people who didn't like the legislation and didn't like the Bureau and didn't like what we were doing. What I can tell you is I was willing, and I always told our people, never mind the chatter, never mind the static. I'll deal with that. Your job is to keep your head down and keep working forward to benefit consumers. And it wasn't always easy to settle people down, but that was part of my job. And I think it toughened me, and I think that was good for me. It's not to say all of it was very pleasant, you know, to be harangued by the Congress in those hearings in front of the House Financial Services Committee every so often, which was at least twice a year and usually more, and be kind of chewed at on every front that they could think of, you know, was not pleasant, but that was part of my job, and I understood that. And I can tell you, too, that with a lot of the institutions around the country, we came to a position of, I think, some mutual respect, because what we tried to encourage the financial institutions to understand was that if we could improve the ways in which they went about doing what they do, it would improve the marketplace. It would foster more confidence from consumers who didn't have to worry they were getting cheated or tricked or trapped on this or that. It would make it possible for consumers to be more aggressive about being engaged in the marketplace. And at the same time, if we reduced their regulatory issues, and by the way, the big banks paid out billions and billions and billions of dollars in fines and penalties and other problems after the financial crisis. You know, it would have been much better if they could have averted that in the first place, and we wouldn't have lost all the jobs and the homes and people's retirement savings in the first place. But if we did that, they would also have fewer lawsuits. They would have better relations with their customers. It's a better marketplace, right? And I think that many of them got that. Some of them didn't. There was a lot of positive change. And by the way, the banks are making plenty of money. But if they're making that money right now by providing quality services with good customer service, then that's the right way to do it. There's also a wrong way to do it, and we were fighting against that. So I would say that I've taken on big issues. I've fought tough fights. I think that's what you want in your governor, and that's what I bring to the table.
That's a great segue to my question, sir. You've talked about a lot of quality of life issues, which are all extremely important. I guess one I wanted to talk a little bit about is the quality of the air we breathe and just the overall integrity of our environment. The state of Ohio has some interesting kind of attitudes and policies that favor fossil fuels and put a lot of obstacles to renewable energy. And I'm just curious about what your position is and what how you would approach that if you became governor.
I favored the policy that was put in place about 10 years ago under Governor Strickland of pushing forward with renewable energy and sustainable energy, and especially wind and solar. And we have parts of the state that are very suited to wind. We are not the mecca of solar, as you would be closer to the equator, but there's plenty of energy that can be gotten from that. And we can do that on public buildings in Ohio, and we can do that by providing more wind turbines in lots of places. I have no earthly reason in mind why the state government doesn't want to continue to push forward with that. It helps contribute to the energy independence of the nation, where we're actually doing quite well right now, but part of that is because we're bringing renewable energy online. It contributes to economic development in our communities. People have to build the solar panels, and they have to build the turbines, and they have to install them, and that's local work. People then benefit because there is revenue produced steadily from those things over time, and sometimes it takes quite a bit of time to pay off the initial investment in them, but it's going to last. It's going to last as long as our country lasts, which is something we should want. So I would be in favor of aggressively moving forward with those programs again and changing what has happened in state government over the past 8 years on that. There are other ways to get energy out of the ground, and we're doing that. I think it needs to be carefully monitored, but I'm not against that. And I think that This has always been a state that's been rich in natural resources going back to the 19th century and oil and gas and so forth. And there's no reason why we shouldn't be looking forward to the natural resources that we can bring to bear that are sustainable. And again, I do not understand why the state government has walked that back. It makes no sense to me, and I'll change that.
Hi, I'm with the League of Women Voters. We are a community partner on all of the Meet the Candidate forums here. But we are also in the midst in Ohio of a citizen initiative to get redistricting on the ballot next fall. Now complicated by the fact that we have put pressure on the legislature, and they're trying to come up with something to put on the May ballot. We don't know if it'll be good, bad, indifferent. Well, we're never indifferent. But what do you think about our plans, our hope to redistrict here in the state? This is on the congressional level.
Yeah, no, I understand. Look, when I was in the legislature, and I served one term there because there was then reapportionment of the state legislature. And it was a nakedly partisan process, and it was done without regard for communities. It was all to the political advantage of incumbent politicians who wanted to make things easier for themselves and easier for their parties to hold majorities, and it had nothing to do with the welfare of how communities work together with one another. And I thought that was wrong at the time, and I was a victim of it. I was out of the General Assembly after one term because of it. So that, I have some personal experience with it. Districting has become a very cynical game in this country, and it has been for a long time, but the use of the computers, the very powerful tools, some of these districts are unbelievable almost. I mean, they'll have lines going down one side of the street to then expand and capture a bit here and then go and then capture a bit there, and it is just for naked partisan advantage. That cannot possibly be good government unless government is what's good for me personally, and I'm the person who's holding the pen or typing into the computer on that. In 2005, I worked with Steve Driehaus in the legislature. I was not in the legislature, but they recruited me to work with him on what was then a redistricting proposal that ended up failing at the ballot. There were too many issues on that year. It just got too cumbersome, and I think voters weren't sure what to make of it all. This is something that we have been pursuing, should be pursuing. We should be setting an example in this regard, and there's some other states that have. Maybe it requires another ballot issue. The legislature has not been all that interested in fair districting, if you ask me. But I will say something about this from the perspective of the governor's race. Having a governor that will face off against the legislature on this and ensure at least a fair break between the two parties will be an enormous change. We have a state that in many respects has been kind of a 50-50 state in presidential elections. Different in 2016, certainly, but competitive state. And to have districts that are four from one party and 12 from another can't possibly be regarded as accurate or appropriate reflection of the people of the state of Ohio. And to have me in the governor's mansion would mean that we would get a fair districting and would be closer to even, and that would be a significant change. As to the details of all that and the lasting details for further decades and further generations, we should get it worked out.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we are enjoying a forum in Ohio 2018 Meet the Candidate Series, a conversation with Richard Cordray, former director of the CFPB and Democratic candidate for governor of Ohio. Our community partner for today's forum is the League of Women Voters. We welcome guests at tables hosted by the City of Cuyahoga Falls Mayor Don Walters, and First Class Campaigns. We thank all of you for being here today. And that brings us to the end of today's forum. Thank you, Mr. Cordray. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Robert Conrad. Cleveland State University, the Chautauqua Institution, the Cleveland Clinic, and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland Incorporated.